Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 14. The first thing we do is remove a problem. The next day, Sergeant Onus looked up from his desk in his office on the western edge of Fort. His window gave him an excellent view of what used to be the forest. Today was the 33rd day of harvest. They'd expected news by the 87th day of weeding, but their estimates were just guesses. No one knew the real distance. The time of 5 weeks was just a goal. And then Mount Deceit got in the way. What that did to the timetable, Onus couldn't imagine. It was now a full 10 weeks since they'd left. While it appeared that the majority of Mount Deceit traveled south, there was no way to see how much may have gone north. There might be nothing left at all. Onus watched the dying tree line. 2 soldiers on horseback trotted along it, scanning up into the forest easily now that there was nothing but gray tree trunks. Major Twig had begun patrols a few weeks ago. Onus had been itching to get soldiers along the edge again just to see. Having someone else suggest the patrols removed Onus from any suspicion. But he did, however, volunteer to supervise the soldiers, so he'd be the first to receive their reports. But they needed to get into the forests. There was nothing left there to harm anyone. But centuries of fear and mistrust were hard to overcome. Conquering the forest would be first, then the boulders. Shouts came from the compound, his name being called by a soldier sprinting to his office. "Sergeant Onus, come quickly! We found survivors!" Onus jumped from his chair and rushed to the door. "Where?" he said, running for the tree line. "Up there, sir," the soldier panted as he ran back to the dead forest. "Looks like 2 bodies up in the woods a few hundred paces. Should we retrieve them?" "You left them there?" Onus bellowed. "Why?" They were almost at the forest's edge, and a collection of 30 soldiers stood along the border, pointing to shapes along the ridge. Onus didn't even pause, but ran straight into the ashy forest. "3 brave men, follow me," he shouted as he scrambled up an incline to the 2 bodies. He heard a few more men following him, tripping and stumbling as they tried to catch up. Onus reached the 2 people and cautiously touched their hands. "They're alive," he shouted. "Unconscious and probably dehydrated, but alive. Let's get them to the surgeon." 10 minutes later, the soldiers and Onus, carrying a man and a teenage girl, jogged to the surgery of the fort. Shouts went ahead of them that survivors had been found alive in the forest. By the time they reached the surgery, several officers were running to meet them, including the young lieutenant who must have snuck past his new tutor. "Survivors!" Lieutenant Thorne exclaimed as the 2 people were rushed down the hall to private rooms. "From the volcano? That was 2 moons ago. Where were they found?" A soldier gestured. "Up there where the fresh spring used to be." "In the forest?" Thorne clarified. "Yes, sir." Surprised, Thorne turned to Sergeant Major Healy next to him. Healy shrugged. "Maybe they came from somewhere else." "But from where?" The lieutenant seemed to choke on his word, but quickly recovered. Onus drew nearer to hear the conversation. "No, they must be from the village," the lieutenant said decidedly, "and wandered there to explore or something." "That seems plausible," Healy suggested with a smirk. "I'm leaning toward something. She seems a bit young to be up there with an adult man. They probably went up there, did their exploring," he said, as 2 other men sniggered, "then got lost or disoriented. I heard the surgeon says he thinks they're dehydrated and exhausted." More ugly chortling followed, but the lieutenant didn't seem to understand why. Troubled, he said, "Well, as soon as they wake up, we should question them, find out what they saw." Healy nodded. "Seems a little odd they got lost when we can see them and they can't see us." Onus waved that off. "Surgeon thinks they've been unconscious for several hours. They probably were lost in the dark, never realizing just how close they were to the village. I'll stay, sirs, and question them when they awake." The lieutenant nodded, still strangely agitated. All right, Sergeant. Let me know as soon as you know something. Of course, Thorn. An hour later, the man began to wake. Onus was by his side, and as he focused on the sergeant, his eyes widened in disbelief. Sergeant Onus merely cocked his head. Doctor, one of our lost souls is awake. The fort surgeon came over. Well, young man, it seems you had quite an adventure. Lucky we found you. Allow me to guess, Onus simpered. You and your friend went out for a midnight stroll, looking for a private place and got lost? The man nodded. Yeah, nearly exactly that. I had heard there was fresh water springs, but we didn't find any. A sharp look from Onus told him to say no more. The surgeon chuckled as he checked the man's pulse. Well, next time you need some privacy, may I recommend someplace less hostile, like the hayloft of a barn? The man smiled weakly. A better idea. Is she all right? She should be. I expect her to wake soon. He motioned for an assistant to bring him a mug of water. The man licked his dry lips anxiously. Doctor, she was saying some strange things last night. When she wakes, please don't listen too carefully. She was weaker than I was, and... The surgeon handed him the mug. Don't worry. When the mind has been deprived of nourishment and is fearing punishment, he lowered his voice. Do her parents know where she is? The man gulped down the water and handed back the empty mug. Sort of. They won't be looking for her for a while. The surgeon indicated for more water. Get her home as soon as she's stable. Think of a good story in the meantime, if you hope to see her again. The man scoffed. Already working on it, sir. Where is she? We have her in a private room down the hall. I was just on my way to check on her. Go ahead, sir, Onus said. I can take care of this man here. The surgeon left, followed by the assistant. Onus closed the door behind him, then came back. So, Onus whispered. The man shook his head. I speak only to my brother. That's not going to be possible, Onus whispered. Lick's dead. The man paled. What? How? Seems Captain Lick wearied the general too much. Thorn killed him in front of everyone at the border battle for Idemia. No, I don't believe it. You can ask anyone you want. There were thousands of witnesses. Onus leaned in closer. You have to believe it if you want to survive Anarchy. Anarchy Kaya closed his eyes in anguish. Why? What happened? A lot since you two parted ways. Thorn now has a new favorite, and even claimed him as his son at that battle. He seemed to think Captain Lick saw his new son as a threat. No, Anarchy whimpered. He was to claim my brother. I told him he was coming on too strong, Onus said. Your brother's ambition got on the general's last nerves. So who did he claim? Anarchy asked wretchedly. I'm hoping you might know, but tell me, what did you find? Anarchy, still trying to comprehend the news of his brother, also knew there was little time before the surgeon returned. Salem, he whispered. Really? Onus said, almost too loudly. How far away? Ludicrously close, just over the mountain, literally. Size? Enormous. Over 100,000, even with the deaths from the pox. Onus released a low whistle. Oh, that's incredible. How badly hit by the volcano? Just some ash. They're making it into block of all things. Onus rubbed his palms on his trousers. So, where's the route? Just to the east of here, but it's much different than it was. There used to be a channel through the rock. Through the rock? But I couldn't find it again, Anarchy sighed. I think it might have been destroyed. There were all kinds of markings as to how to get through, but everything's changed. We were trapped above the boulders. Took us forever to get down here, and we haven't had water in 2 days. Couldn't find the springs. The whole forest is dead, Onus told him, so it's no longer a barrier. But the boulder field sounds like a problem. There's no way to take horses through. They used to, but now... Anarchy groaned softly. What do we do? Everything's lost. I'm working on it. The first thing we do is remove a problem. Who the general claimed? Anarchy asked. Yes, and you're not going to believe this, but they think he's Colonel Shin's grandson. Anarchy scoffed. I believe it. He had something like a dozen. Really? Onus exclaimed again, barely remembering to keep his voice low. So they made it out? Oh yes, they made it out all right, with Zenas. We even rode to Salem with one of the Shin grandsons. Their families have even intermarried. Get this, there's a boy named Brighter Zenas. Unbelievable, Onus muttered. So he might really be a Shin. Who? Anarchy asked. A tall, black-haired boy. You'll see him soon. He's been made a lieutenant for no discernible reason, the little Zenas upstart. They say he looks just like the colonel. Anarchy tried to sit up. They're missing a boy, about 19 or 20 years old. He ran away just over a year ago. Onus sat back in his chair. That's when I first got him as a new recruit. Who's his father? Anarchy scoffed again. Rector Pato Shin. I had the pleasure of punching him in the jaw myself. Fantastic, Onus whispered. This could change everything. Anarchy, what about the colonel? Is he dead? And Salem made him their general. He died last year sometime. But she's still alive. Onus let out another whistle. And Zenas? Anarchy rolled his eyes. He's the guide. All of Salem worships him. The slagging man who abducted my father. But Onus didn't care to hear any more about his crazed father. He ran his hands through his hair, nearly pulling some of it out in his enthusiasm. This is unbelievable. A grin spread across his face. So many possibilities. I'm so happy for you, Anarchy said sarcastically. So what will I get for all of my suffering? Onus scoffed. You got the daughter. I saw her. Pretty enough. Looks rather young, though. Anarchy sneered. She's not the one who insisted on that old man marrying us. I left that one back in Salem. Beautiful, but as mean as a wasp. I came back with the youngest. She hated Salem as much as I did. I thought we could present her to her father if necessary. Does she know that? Sort of. She's rather open to ideas, if you know what I mean. We can use her however we need to. Onus nodded. You'll be rewarded, don't worry. I can get you a uniform like I did for your brother, and say you came from Winds. But all I have left in your size is a lieutenant's uniform. They had to burn the tailor shop. I've got nowhere else to go, do I? Anarchy flopped on his cot again. What happened to Midplane? It's gone, Onus whispered. Everything that used to be on the Idamere River is gone until Pools. Be glad you weren't here. Anarchy sighed in pain. So who holds Idamere now? Onus smiled. That's the one part of the plan that came through. General Thorne's got the world, and he's going to be looking for some help soon. Anarchy sat up partway. Thorne's got it all? That's the first good news I've heard in a long time. Can you see the possibilities? Onus poked him gently. The world's devastated, Anarchy. Food supplies are already running low, and the citizens will be panicking. Thorne's got huge problems trying to unite the North and South while cleaning up the mess left by deceit. And his son up here thinks he rules the world. Anarchy sneered. Oh, he does he? Onus smiled thinly. So far, everyone lets him think that, but they're getting tired of him strutting around the fort and telling people what to do. Who wants to take orders from a general wannabe? No, Anarchy, it will still work. This game of dice has more silver chips than anyone's ever considered playing with. And we still have one more. Anarchy looked at him, confused. Who? Thorn's last mistress. Something your brother said to me once now makes sense. He was sure our new lieutenant came with her. So that means Miss Amory is also from Salem. Anarchy sniggered. It's an invasion. Not yet, Anarchy, Ona said with a smile. But it will be. They heard a knock at the door and turned to see it open. A tall, black-haired lieutenant stood there. I was curious to see the patient. Are you well enough to talk? Anarchy raised an eyebrow and glanced at Sergeant Onus. Lieutenant Thorne may have looked just like his grandfather, but he also looked a great deal like Rector Shin. So, what's the official story about the two people found up in the forest? Professor Slither asked as he shoved a sugary pastry into his mouth, bits of it falling sloppily to the table. Lieutenant Thorne clenched his fist. Dinner had been dull by himself, and while sometimes he wished he'd had company, he didn't want this kind of company. Watching the professor eat was like watching 1-year-olds feed themselves. Seems he snuck her away for a little private time in the forest, but they got lost, he said, pushing around the food on his plate. I heard he was an officer, Slither said before he took another enormous bite. The lieutenant shrugged. Still trying to establish that. He says he can get his uniform as proof and that he left it in the forest where he changed his clothes. Odd clothing, too, I heard, Slither said. Not like any of the current fashions. No, the lieutenant agreed and tried not to fidget. They'd looked suspiciously like the plain clothing Salemites wore, but maybe that was a coincidence. He said they were clothes his girlfriend had made them. That's why they were so simple. Not a lot of cloth to work with right now. Ah, Slither said. And we're believing that? The lieutenant looked up. What else would we believe? Slither shrugged. Oh, I don't know, he said as he reached for another pastry. Sergeant Major Healy was by earlier, asking what I remember about garter clothing. He thought their tunics and trousers were reminiscent of the old garter outfits. You may not realize it, but Healy had some dealings with garters when he was a teenager. He met a few, but only late at night and in the dark. His recollection of their clothing wasn't too clear. The lieutenant was nodding before he realized that maybe he shouldn't be. There had been Salemites in the forests, always, in plain tunics and trousers, but dyed mottle greens and browns to camouflage themselves. In the rare times they were spotted, villagers had assumed they were garters. But garters, who were simply raiders from other villages, always wore black. Slither watched him closely as he chewed, probably seeing the confusion racing across the lieutenant's face as he tried to sort out what was truth and what was the accepted story in the world. The lieutenant cleared his throat, realizing that he wasn't sure what the official story was now about the old garters. Sir, I'd heard that once about Healy, that he was involved with them as a young man. He thinks they are garters? He held his breath, hoping his question was leading enough. Slither shrugged again and shoved the rest of the pastry into his mouth. Maybe she found some old clothing somewhere, he garbled, desperate to find something new to wear. Wish we had a way to investigate her background. Maybe her ancestors were garters with secrets stashed in the trunk in the attic. Or maybe someone's trying to start something again in the forest. The lieutenant frowned. But why? I mean, there are no more garters, haven't been for years. Why would someone want to start anything in the forests now? Seems unnecessary. Slither scoffed. Ugh, unnecessary? I can think of plenty of reasons. First, there's not enough food. Garters were excellent thieves, you know. That's all they really were, thieves and murderers. The lieutenant looked at the full table. What are you talking about? There's plenty of food. There's plenty for us, Slither said. In an emergency, you need to preserve the hierarchy to prevent anarchy. But everyone else? He bit another pastry. They don't have you on patrols for a reason, Lieutenant, to keep you away from the violence. Violence? What violence? Can't have anything happening to the General's son now, Slither droned on, as if the lieutenant hadn't interrupted. That's why they keep you to the fort and won't allow any more of your forays into the forest, which was most senseless and dangerous. The lieutenant sighed. Major Twig had yelled at him for 15 minutes about that when he returned to make his report. Twig told him that even though he hadn't encountered anything alive, there were still bottomless caverns and other unknown hazards, and under no circumstance was the lieutenant to go out on his own ever again. He pretty much ignored the lecture and did what he always did when he was in trouble. Counted the number of planks on the back wall. There were 37. I thought it important for you to know what's really happening, the old professor went on, so you don't end up in a dangerous situation. However, Major Twig, who's the most obedient, his tone suggested boot-licking sycophant, officer I've ever met, told me he had instructions from Thorne to keep you out of trouble. But since you asked, as your professor, I'm obligated to answer your every question. He smiled in satisfaction. The lieutenant shook his head in dismay. No, there's enough. I looked at the inventory pages myself. The emergency storehouses in the village have enough grain for a full year. Slither's smirk stopped him. Do they really? Have you inspected the storehouses yourself? Because if they are the same here as they are in Idemia, the only bags of grain are on paper. It'll be empty, I assure you. You know, he said thoughtfully, it always seemed unnecessary to keep those things stocked. He tossed some raisins into his mouth. And since it was Colonel Shin's idea, many thought it was influenced by that wife of his as a way of making the citizenry do extra work each harvest. He chuckled mirthlessly. Now it seems to have not been a bad idea after all. Who would have guessed? He leaned back and patted his belly in satisfaction. The lieutenant had no more appetite as he stared at the full platters on the table. So where does all of this come from? The General's private store, Slither said. Biggest seller in Edge, I imagine. It's guarded. Of course, all the commanders keep their cellars guarded. Even in the best of times, there are thieves at work. A guarded cellar? The lieutenant had never explored the entire mansion. There were his sections, and then the maids and servants and soldiers' sections that he never concerned himself with. Still staring at the remains of their dinner, he asked, So where does all of this go? Slither waved casually. Divided up between the help and the soldiers guarding the mansion. Benefits of serving the general, you know. They get treated well, too. Why do you think they're so loyal? The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. Are they? Do you know of any who aren't? No, not really. It just hadn't occurred to me that everyone wasn't eating like we are. There's a coming famine, boy. He motioned to the windows and the world beyond. Not enough crops were harvested. There may be no reserves in the storehouses, and everyone's on rationed grain. Things were better further south when I left, but for how long? If you were allowed to ride around Edge, you could take a look at people and see they're losing weight. But if you ask me, they look better for it. He let a loud belch escape and patted his belly again. It's been a long day, and I'm ready for an early evening. But you have a few chapters to read before you turn in, Lieutenant Thorne. I expect your analysis on the next 3 chapters of Negotiations on my desk before midday meal tomorrow. He stood up with a groan and waddled out of the eating room. The lieutenant stared at the food on the table. Why shouldn't he eat well? He was the future general of the world and a large man. But he also found himself haunted by the memory of foraging through the waste heaps looking for anything edible. Pushing his plate away, he realized that there was enough still for half a dozen people. The help of the mansion would eat well because of him. Wasn't that enough payment, his leftovers? He got up, went to the kitchen door, and stuck his head in. I'm finished here, so's the professor. The cook, a slender, middle-aged woman, regarded him uncertainly. She'd never seen the lieutenant peer into the kitchen before. Very good, sir, she nodded, and looked as if she wanted the door to be shut again. The lieutenant closed it and slipped into the small gathering room off the eating room. A moment later, he heard the dishes being collected. He strode out of the gathering room, down the hall, and out the back service door. The sun was beginning to set as he crept along the mansion, hidden by the shriveled shrubs until he came to the kitchen door. The window next to it was open slightly, and he heard several voices entering the kitchen. He heard the guards and maids dividing up what was left. Although there were 8 of them, they could eat well enough. He couldn't make out their conversation, but it was punctuated by hard laughter. Voices moved to the back door. I told you, it's my night. We agreed to the rotation, and just because you were late yesterday doesn't mean you get to take my night. But it's not fair. You went last night in my stead, and now you're going again? I'm one of the favorites. What can I say? Besides, it'll make up for last week when I missed when I had the pox. Good evening to you all, and don't bother waiting up. The lieutenant crouched as the kitchen door opened. One of the guards came bounding out, a small bundle under his arm, and he jogged into the growing darkness. The lieutenant glanced around before following the soldier at a safe distance. He walked briskly along the quiet roads of Edge, heading west, turning down one road, then another. The lieutenant kept back, but the soldier never looked behind. Finally, he stopped at a large house and marched up to the front door. The lieutenant ducked behind a tree and grumbled under his breath. It was the old rectory, where Amory was staying. The soldier knocked rhythmically, and a moment later the door swung open. In the twilight, the lieutenant could just make out Amory. The soldier held up the bundle, and she let him in. Feeding Amory! The lieutenant growled quietly and stole across the road. She did say she trusted the staff completely, and here they were using his food to feed her. What did she offer the world? Nothing. Why should his provisions go to feed a used-up sow? He slipped around the house to the back door, where he assumed the eating room was, and could hear voices. Amory's, then the soldier's, then another woman's voice. It sounded like a good-natured quarrel. He slid over to the window to better listen in. So where's Clamid? I thought it was his night. Ah, come on, Miss Amory. You really want Clamid when he can have me? I'm doing you a favor. Hey, you know the rules. Not until I see what you brought. You break my rules, you go back to the mansion. The soldier snickered. Then you don't get what I brought. You really think you're my only one? Amory said. There are 5 other soldiers in that house, Hef. All of them as eager as you to provide me with what I want. This is a privilege. I've taught you things, and you know it. Now, are you going to show me what you have, or am I going to kick you out? My maid and I have other things we can be doing. Take your hand off me now. All right, Hef said in a low voice. All right. I even stole you a sugared pastry. That's got to be worth at least 10 minutes. The lieutenant's eyebrows furrowed, trying to puzzle out why a sugared pastry would be worth 10 minutes. 10 minutes of what? A moment later, he heard Amory again. Hef, I hate to admit it, but you did rather well. The poor lieutenant's appetite must be waning. There's a reason you're one of my favorites, even though you think too highly of yourself. 15 minutes. 15? Come on, there's some great eating in here. Do you have any idea how much this goes for in the village? 15 minutes with me, Amory clarified. My maid's been tired lately. And do you have any idea how much I go for? Now, when have you been able to claim I gave you 2 nights in a row?" The lieutenant's mouth dropped open in shock. He'd heard about women like this, and several hung around the gates of the fort. But Amory becoming one of them? He slumped to the ground and tried to ignore the sounds of footsteps going upstairs. His food was commodity for... Disgusted, he resolved to confront her as soon as Hef left. The lieutenant stewed in fury, forgetting he was there as a spy when another soldier timidly made his way to the front door. There was knocking, the maid giggling, and more footsteps fading away as the maid undoubtedly led that soldier upstairs. The lieutenant wondered if anything else had been stolen from the mansion to win a few minutes with the tired maid. Eventually he heard the front door open again and saw Hef trotting down the stairs and into the dark night, whistling. The lieutenant bolted from his hiding place, marched to the front door, and pounded on it until it flew open. "How dare you pound on my door like—" "Oh," Amory said shortly. She leaned against the doorway. "What do you want?" He was momentarily startled by her appearance. While her countenance had changed over the past year, when she left the mansion 2 moons ago, she still appeared beautiful. Now her features were hard and disfigured, aging her beyond her years. But the lieutenant was alarmed that, despite everything, she still aroused something in him. "You are in possession of stolen property," the lieutenant barked at her, "and I want it back." To his surprise, Amory chuckled. "Ha ha, word got back to you, did it? Well, it's too late, pear. What I offered to you for free many weeks ago now comes at a price, and the only way you'll get it is to pay for it. What are you offering?" "How dare you!" the lieutenant snapped at her. She didn't even blink at his tirade, but stared at him, bored. So he tried again. "How dare you assume the son of the general would want something like that from someone like you?" "The general used to," she said easily, "and he'll want it again when he returns. So why not his son?" The lieutenant was beyond astonished. "What has happened to you, Amory?" he whispered. "You!" she shouted. She looked around quickly before continuing in a furious whisper. "You are what happened to me. I refused to starve and die a slow death like everyone else. 8 weeks ago I had everything, Perrin Shin. A home, a man, a future. And now you came along and stole all of it. Well, I'm warning you." She held up a thin and angry finger. "I'm going to get it back, even if I have to destroy you like you've destroyed me. Just watch your back, Lieutenant, because from what I hear, I'm not the only one who's losing patience watching you strut around the fort." "What are you talking about?" he said, trying to sound angry, but feeling suddenly fearful. She noticed. "Seriously, Lieutenant, you think that everyone adores you? That the army is happy that Thorne found his so-called long-lost son? Oh, please. You just leapfrogged over all the enlisted men to become a lieutenant who hasn't even completed 1 year of command school. And every officer now knows he's not next in line to inherit whatever Thorne leaves behind once he dies, because it will all go to you. Even the citizens are sick of you. They have a name, the Little Lieutenant. They say the old colonel walked with them, but you swagger past them, like a rooster on parade, without the slightest idea he's about to become tomorrow's dinner." The lieutenant glared, not daring to believe a word of it. She met his glare. Lemuel knew he had enemies before, but now he doesn't have a single one. You know why? Because everyone now hates you. All I have to do is wait for someone's patience to snap and take you out. Then I get to move back into the mansion. Honestly, I'm surprised you survived this long. I think everyone's hoping someone else will take you out and save them the trouble. I know I am." The lieutenant gulped as he stared into Amory's hard eyes. She wasn't lying. "So," she said, "do you still want to see if I have any stolen property? Because if you barge into my house and take food from my table, there will be a dozen angry men ready to hunt you down. I'm developing friends all over Edge, Lieutenant. Friends who value my services and will come to my defense. So if I were you, Lieutenant, I'd get off this front porch, scurry back to my little mansion, and watch my back all the way there. Remember," she said in barely a whisper, "I know who your father and mother really are." And she slammed the door. Lieutenant Thorne was breathless when he reached the mansion. His run-walk home was filled with anxiety he'd never felt before. The citizens were sick of him. The soldiers and officers resented him. Everyone always liked him, in Salem and here. He was charming and handsome and Perrin Shin's grandson. What was there not to like? Nothing. He was just Thorne's son. He remembered Nelt's words back in Pools. Everyone hangs back from Thorne, waiting for him to be cut down. Now everyone was hanging back from his son as well, out of striking distance should someone swing at him. Would anyone defend him? The only man he could think of was Sergeant Onus. Occasionally he still waved kindly as he passed, but Onus was the only one. The lieutenant had to admit he had no friends among the enlisted. That was probably his fault. Since he was no longer in their ranks, he snubbed his lowly group of 20. They were beneath him now, after all. But he also didn't fit in with the ranks of the rest of the officers, although he tried by giving recommendations and ideas as often as possible. Usually they just looked at him blankly, then went back to their discussions. Their lack of interaction might be because they didn't like him. Could that be true? He thought they were intimidated by who he was, but maybe the reasons were worse. Maybe Amory was right. There just might be more plots against him now than there were in Pools. He barged through the front doors of the mansion, slammed them shut behind him, and held his breath when he saw the armed soldier standing at attention at the entry. "I could have gotten the door for you, sir," he said. "Not at all. You work hard enough," he said with an uncomfortable chuckle. "I can certainly get the door myself. And while I'm here, if you wished, you sit down for a while you're on guard. I don't have a problem with that, really." The guard cocked his head slightly. "But General Thorne would, sir, and I wouldn't want to do anything that would upset the general. Would you wish me to upset the general?" No, not at all. I wouldn't want you to upset the general either," he said, trying to control his panic. "I just meant that things are so quiet here that if you wanted to rest—" "Sir," the soldier interrupted carefully, "it's never as quiet as it seems. I remain at my post and on guard." He took a more formal stance and stared off into the distance. The lieutenant gestured uselessly. Yes, very well, thank you. Good work," he added lamely, hoping that maybe he'd made a friend in the mansion. At Professor Slither's room, he paused to glance in since the door was partially open. The professor was slumped in a large cushioned chair, snoring lightly, a book propped up on his chest. The lieutenant bit his lip. The old professor might be another defender, since he was the only man in the village who stood to benefit from the lieutenant's success. He crept in quietly and lifted the book off his chest to set it on the side table, but was surprised at the title, "The Writings." For some reason, the lieutenant wanted to put the book down as quickly as possible. But first he glanced to see what pages Slither had been reading. He made a face when he saw the book was open to where the Creator established his rule of law for the people. Why would Professor Slither care about that? He placed the book on the table and noticed a stack of notes there. The professor's handwriting was shaking and scrawling, but the lieutenant could just make out some of the words in the dim light. commanded to be obedient. Great blessings promised those who are faithful. Guides provided to ensure the laws are followed. Guides receive continued inspiration on leading the people. The lieutenant covered the notes with the still open book, not wanting to read or remember any of that. It was odd that such a man was taking notes about the writings. The lieutenant pulled a small blanket from the bed and gently covered the professor with it before blowing out the candles that still burned in the room. He left the guest room, walked up the stairs, nodded with what he hoped was an amiable smile to the soldier standing guard at the top, and made his way to the bedroom. Once inside, he closed the door and locked it. He never did that before, but then again, he'd never felt the need. Each of those guards had pledged to keep Amory safe. Now they were there to keep him safe. But what if they didn't want to? Perhaps they left their posts at night to visit her, supplying her with more than just food, maybe even information about what he was doing each day. Then another thought hit him. Who else in the village or fort visited Amory, and what kind of gossip could she supply them? It was a mess, a dangerous mess, where he realized the only man who really cared about his welfare, in addition to a mid-ranking sergeant and the old fat man downstairs, was over 80 miles away in Idemia, and even he was willing to hand him over to his greatest enemy on a gamble. The lieutenant stepped to his bed, glanced underneath to make sure there wasn't anyone under it, then hopped on top. He didn't light any candles, in case their soft glow would reveal someone else waiting in his bedroom. If they were to strike, they would have done so by now, right? Still in his uniform, he curled up into a ball on the corner of his bed, his back against the corner, and stared anxiously at the door, the window, the door again. Everyone hated him. The word sent a shiver down his spine. Not even his cousins or brothers really hated him, but maybe they did. Maybe they felt about him the same way as Edgers did. He didn't swagger as far as he knew. True, he made people harvest the crops and created rationing lists. Maybe that was something people hated him for. He limited the amount of grain, and everyone ate less because of his calculations. But it wasn't his fault there wasn't enough food. It was the volcanoes. What had he done to annoy the soldiers? He went to the officers' briefings and gave his suggestions, inspected the fort and gave his recommendations for improvement. He gripped his face because he was strutting and telling everyone what to do. That was precisely what irritated him so much in Salem. His relatives telling him what he was doing wrong and what he needed to do better. And now he was doing it to the fort and Edge. He groaned as he realized that in an extraordinarily bizarre set of circumstances, he had become as annoying and self-righteous as Cephas Brighter. No wonder everyone hated him. Rubbing his forehead, he decided that tomorrow he'd have to start fixing things. He almost felt like praying for help. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.